Ben Velasquez was a little boy with a big smile and an even bigger heart.
He was an independent little boy, super sweet.
A compassionate, contemplative child who seemed wise beyond his years.
One time a second grade teacher told me, he's like an old soul. He should be wearing a tweed jacket and have a little pipe, you know? And he was like that.
Ben played baseball, but his true passion was designing and building.
He was constantly building and tinkering and taking things apart.
He was a master of technology, a young entrepreneur.
From like 10 to 15, he would get on Craigslist and buy used cell phones. He would flip them, fix them, flip them.
And despite his quiet nature, he was always surrounded by friends.
He had 12 to 15 friends, nonstop.
Ben was so determined to succeed, he took vocational classes while he was still in high school, so he could work as a certified mechanic.
He said that way, it's a 2-year program, that way when I graduate from high school, I'll be able to be doing mechanics while I'm going to college. So he already had that plan.
Ben stayed true to his plan, and after graduating from high school, he enrolled in College of Marin and set his sights on a career in engineering.
He wanted to be a mechanical engineer.
But now the memories that would make any mother proud.
He was our everything.
Bring Ben's mom to tears.
You know, when you have a child, you think about his future. You think about who he'll be when he gets older. You don't think about a tragedy or an accident.
Because a tragedy not only stole Ben's future, it took away his past and left him a shell of the bright young man he used to be.
I have no recollection of the accident. No recollection of before the accident, like months before the accident or years. With this injury, I remember what I ate this morning. That's about all.
It was November 20th, 2015. 19-year-old Ben Velasquez was wearing a helmet, driving his motorcycle on westbound Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, on his way to College of Marin. That's when Amy Glass became impatient with traffic and decided to cut left from eastbound Sir Francis Drake onto Broadway. Unfortunately, Glass was unable to see Ben in the number 1 lane because of the negligently maintained and overgrown median. Ben tried to veer from the number 1 lane into the number 2 lane to avoid Glass's car, but it was too late. Ben's motorcycle T-boned the Audi, his body slamming into the vehicle before being thrown off the back. Ben was unconscious and clinging to life as paramedics rushed him to Marin General Hospital.
The emergency room doctor looked at both of us and he said, "You need to go and say goodbye to him." And they said they had to shunt his head and put a ventilator in there so he could receive oxygen. And he said that he probably won't make it.
Meanwhile, back at the scene, Amy Glass told the Marin County, California Highway Patrol that she did not see Ben's motorcycle approaching in the lane closest to the median.
1001, 1002, 1003.
And this cell phone video captured right after the crash by Ben's uncle shows us why. The intersection had become a tragedy waiting to happen, with its unmaintained 6-foot-wide bushes blocking the view of oncoming traffic in the number 1 lane, the same lane Ben was using on his way to school.
I was like, oh my God, I would never want another mother to go through this or someone have an accident because someone didn't take care of the trees and the bushes.
The Marin County, California Highway Patrol also noted the dangerous vision obscurement and blamed the overgrown bushes and Glass's failure to yield for causing the crash. Not surprisingly, expert traffic engineers later deemed the intersection unsafe for a left turn onto Broadway. Due to the bushes and the configuration of the road, it determined the available sight distance is only 228 feet. That's 82 feet short of the 310-foot minimum sight distance required by the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. Ironically, while Ben was in the ICU in a coma, with a diffuse axonal brain injury, right cerebral contusion, cervical spinal cord injury, occipital fracture, C5, C6, and C7 vertebrae fractures, T1, T5, and T6 vertebrae fractures, L1 and L2 vertebrae fractures, left scapula fracture, left multiple rib fractures, right rib fracture, right wrist fracture, MSSA bronchopneumonia, cardiac contusion, bilateral lung contusion, emphysematous bleb, and hyponatremia.
And there's been swollen, hooked up to a respirator with a shunt in his brain.
Marin County sent its gardeners with their $20 pruning shears to cut the bushes that nearly cost Ben his life. Ben's mom and dad stayed by his bedside round the clock.
I slept in the waiting room and Lance slept in the room, and then at 2 in the morning we switched and I went in the room and Lance slept in the waiting room.
But he remained unconscious and unresponsive.
We just basically watched the emergency nurses keep him alive, and the things that they would tell us what they're doing to keep him alive.
After 20 days in the ICU with very little improvement, Ben was airlifted to Kaiser Vacaville, where he spent 50 more days in the ICU, eyes open but still in an unconscious state.
Raise your hand, Ben.
On Christmas Eve, doctors broke the devastating news to Ben's parents that their only son should be placed in a subacute care facility until he died.
They were ready to write him off. Kaiser was.
But Ben's parents refused to give up hope and fought to have him transferred to Santa Clara Valley Medical Center, a hospital that specializes in brain injuries. And it was there, after 3 months in an unconscious state, a true miracle occurred. Ben had an awakening.
I look at him every day and think he's a walking miracle. Yeah.
He began to respond to his parents, first by batting a balloon, eating and drinking, and brushing his teeth. Eventually, Ben started to talk.
What was on the floor next to the bed?
Socks.
That's where we just saw him start to blossom and start to respond.
But his severe right-sided and frontal lobe brain injury left him paralyzed on the left side and in a wheelchair. Ben went through several more weeks of rehab to learn how to walk before finally being released from the hospital 135 days after the crash.
When they brought him there, he had to be lifted in this like white banded thing, like a horse or a, you know, he had to be lifted out of the wheelchair and into the bed. And when he left there, he could just have a board and scoot off the board and into the wheelchair.
But when Ben returned to his mother's newly modified home, the hard work had only just begun.
We had to have the wheelchair ramp in the front. The house was completely, the rugs, the furniture was completely taken out.
He was still in a wheelchair and being fed through a tube. He could not control his bladder or bowels, and he needed round-the-clock care.
He had a shower chair, a wheelchair, a toilet seat chair, and then I bought him a very expensive bed.
Ben's mother and father stopped working so they could provide that care.
You have to figure out how to pay the bills and then also care for him.
And their dedication paid off. With the help of in-home therapy, Ben started using a walker. Then he began to walk short distances. Now, 2 years after the crash, he spends his days in occupational, physical, and speech therapy, trying to improve the paralysis on his left side, his balance and coordination, and most of all, his memory.
Sticks. Key.
But no matter how hard he tries, he cannot remember even the simplest things. He has so much trouble learning new information, he cannot go to school. He's not safe to drive.
The confidence is gone, the independence is gone.
He's never regained the use of his left arm or hand, making it impossible for him to return to his job as a mechanic.
He can't do the things that he is most passionate about, like work on motorcycles.
And he relies on his parents for just about everything.
I miss that independent person, the guy that did everything on his own, even when he was little. You know, got up and made his own cereal, got up and made his own breakfast. He's just now starting to do those things, but I miss that for him. Like, for his sake, that he can't do that.
And the young man, who always had so many friends, has become antisocial.
He completely shut his friends off.
Ben gets angry and depressed.
Are there days when you don't feel like facing the day?
Every day. Every day.
But other times he's filled with a childlike optimism and unrealistic expectations.
Because of all these therapies and stuff, I also know that I am expected to fully heal, and all these things will just take time.
But neuropsychologist Dr. Fernando Miranda says Ben's severe brain injury and paralysis will not get any better.
It's a real miracle that he actually recovered consciousness to a certain degree. But for practical purposes, he's like a 6 or 7 year old with very little judgment.
Dr. Miranda says Ben's severe frontal lobe traumatic brain injury is having a devastating effect on his ability to function.
His working memory is clearly abnormal. His attention is abnormal. He has very little, if any, judgment, which means that he will have to be significantly supervised in all decisions. He's like, again, like a 6 year old. Do you allow a 6 year old to cook dinner? No. Why? Because probably he would not remember all the ingredients, but most importantly, he would not be safe.
For that reason, Ben will never be safe to live on his own.
He will have constant supervision for the rest of his life. People that tell him what drugs to take, the amount, because if you leave it to him, he won't be able to be responsible enough to do that. Number two, he will never be able to drive. He has a left-sided weakness, which is clearly there, but the right side is not normal either. Okay? So that gives him altered reflexes. Can he react like presumably you and I to a car putting brakes in front of him? No.
Dr. Miranda says Ben's injury is made worse by fluid and numerous small bleeds inside his brain, which will require another brain surgery in the very near future.
So when you bleed in the brain, you produce scar tissue that makes the convexities of the brain not be able to reabsorb the spinal fluid. So you produce more than what you absorb. And as time goes on, that becomes really significant to the point then that the brain is at pressure from the inside.
Dr. Miranda says Ben is also suffering from anosognosia, meaning he is not aware of the extent of his limitations and will require years of psychotherapy. Dr. Paul Berg, a clinical psychologist with more than 50 years of experience, says Ben is already suffering from depression. But Ben's inability to see how much help he needs will make him difficult to treat. In Dr. Berg's evaluation of Ben, he said, given the multifaceted scope of Ben's injuries, his psychotherapy will be very prolonged and arduous. And if he ever reaches a point where it is clear to him that he has limited out his ability to make any more improvement, then he will be dealing with a much clearer depression, which will need to be addressed in psychotherapy, along with appropriate psychotropic medication. Physical medicine and rehabilitation doctor Alex Barchuk credits Ben's daily occupational, physical, and speech therapies for the progress he's made. But he still needs help performing the daily tasks of living.
He has difficulty with anything that requires both of the extremities to work in a normal fashion. He has difficulty putting on his shoes, his socks. We talked about trimming his toenails. He has difficulty with buttons, with the zippers. He has difficulty even using a cell phone. He could use it with his right hand, but he can't use it with both hands. We talked about typing. It's difficult for him to do. And then anything that has to do with higher balance type of activities. Even walking on an uneven surface, his balance is off.
Unfortunately, Dr. Barchuk says, Ben's condition is expected to get much worse.
He's already lost a lot of neurons. So as he gets older, and we're talking, right now he's 21 years of age, we're talking in his mid-30s, later 30s, not when he's 60 years old. This is going to start happening in his 30s, and it's going to get worse in his 40s and 50s, and he is at very, very high risk for dementia. And that's probably going to happen because of the extent of his brain injury.
And as Ben's brain deteriorates, so too will his physical disabilities.
He'll probably need either a cane. As he gets older, he'll probably need a walker because his balance is going to get worse, and he's going to become more and more dependent on a wheelchair. And the arm and the leg that's functioning quote unquote normally, it's going to have trouble with overuse type of injury. So the first thing that goes is the shoulder joint, because you're constantly using your arm. That and the wrist joint. He already has quite a bit of wrist pain, and he doesn't have normal range of motion in the wrist because he had fractures in the wrist area. So post-traumatic arthritis is going to set in. It's going to cause more pain in his wrist. It's going to cause more and more pain regarding his hand function. His shoulder is going to get worse. The right leg is going to get more and more arthritic. His knees, his hips, because he's depending more on his right side to compensate for his left side.
And while Ben requires constant supervision now, Dr. Barchuk says in the next 5 to 10 years, he will need round-the-clock in-home care.
The only way that he would have a shortened lifespan is another accident. And if you leave him alone, don't give him the appropriate supervision, he's going to have an accident. So that's why it's important when you put together a life care plan, you need to provide enough support, medical support, therapeutic support, and psychological support to make sure that the individual has the least amount of chances of hurting themselves or becoming more and more disabled. So if you give him the appropriate care, he should live a normal life expectancy. If you don't, if you leave him on his own, then something bad's going to happen with him, and he could easily lose his life.
Ben's parents can't help but worry about what will happen to their only son when they are gone.
What is his life going to look like now?
But rather than fear the future, Ben tries to focus on each day, one step at a time.
I could sit here and cry about it, but I know that that's not going to do me any good. So I kind of just go on.
And Ben's parents are proud of how far he's come and grateful he's alive.
I'm so grateful, and I'll take him any way he is, you know.